The story of Gomer Pyle and Sergeant Carter began on a typical afternoon at the Marine Corps base. The air was filled with the rhythmic sounds of military life, but inside the duty hut, a different kind of tension was brewing. Sergeant Vince Carter was engaged in a game of cards with his rival, Sergeant Hacker. The atmosphere was thick with smoke and the quiet intensity of two seasoned veterans trying to outmaneuver one another. Hacker leaned back, a smug expression on his face. He had just finished listening to one of his men pour out his heart, a task he handled with a performative level of patience. He turned to Carter and remarked that the sergeant should take it easy. Hacker suggested that the young man sleep on his troubles and they would talk again tomorrow, expressing a feigned confidence that everything would work out. Carter looked at Hacker with utter disbelief. He asked if 10 minutes with a private made Hacker the base chaplain. Hacker shrugged, claiming that whenever his boys had problems, they came running to him because he was their father image. Carter scoffed, telling him to just play the cards. The game continued until Carter accused Hacker of looking at his hand. Hacker denied it, but Carter insisted on a new deal. As they shuffled the deck, Hacker continued to needle Carter about his relationship with his men. He claimed he had a certain rapport that Carter lacked. He asked if Carter's men ever confided in him or brought him their problems. Carter barked back that he was not a professional advice columnist and that he looked at his job through the lens of experience. He knew all the angles and didn't feel the need to wet nurse every recruit. Hacker laughed, pointing out that Carter's lack of patience was the reason his men stayed away. To prove a point, he goaded Carter into a bet. He wagered $50 that Carter could not go 24 hours without losing his temper or yelling at his men. Carter, fueled by pride and the desire to prove he was in complete control, accepted the challenge. He declared that the only explosion anyone would hear would be the sound of champagne corks popping when he collected the money. The clock was set at exactly 1700 hours. The challenge had officially begun. The next morning, Sergeant Carter stood before his platoon, determined to project an aura of calm and understanding. He blew his whistle and ordered the men to move, but he kept his voice firm without reaching his usual deafening volume. He called the men together and announced that he wanted to prove he had rapport. He asked if anyone had a personal problem they would like to discuss with an older, wiser, and patient mentor. The men stood in stunned silence. They looked at each other, confused by this sudden shift in their sergeant's personality. Finally, Gomer Pyle stepped forward. Gomer was a kind-hearted, honest soul from Mayberry who often saw the best in everyone, even when they were shouting in his face. He told the sergeant that he had a personal problem he was embarrassed to discuss in front of the others. Carter, sensing victory in his quest for rapport, invited Gomer into the duty hut. Gomer explained that during his last dental checkup, the dentist informed him that he had an underbite. It was not severe, but it could be corrected with a retainer. This device involved steel wires and a strap that went around the neck, to be worn only at night. Gomer was torn about whether the effort was worth the trouble and asked for the sergeant's wisdom. Carter's face began to redden. He felt the familiar pressure building in his chest. He looked at Gomer and told him to get out, calling the underbite problem stupid and a waste of his time. Gomer tried to explain further, but Carter pointed to the door and shouted for him to leave. Outside, Sergeant Hacker was waiting with a grin. He reminded Carter that he had already lost his temper. Carter tried to argue that he was still in control, but Hacker pointed out that 24 hours was a long time. Meanwhile, Hacker decided to speed things up. He found Gomer and pretended to be interested in the underbite. He told Gomer that Carter actually missed their father and son talks and encouraged Gomer to go back and interrupt the sergeant's train of thought with more questions. Gomer, believing Hacker's lies, returned to the duty hut. He found Carter trying to relax and began explaining how the underbite prevented him from efficiently eating corn on the cob. He mentioned he was always the last one to finish an ear of corn at the mess hall. Carter, teeth clenched and eyes bulging, told Gomer to just get the retainer and leave. As the hours ticked by, the situation grew more absurd. Gomer, in his attempt to be helpful, accidentally knocked over a precious sword that Carter had kept as a memento from his time in the service. Gomer apologized profusely, but then accidentally rubbed the skin on Carter's hand while trying to inspect the sword for damage. Later, Gomer nearly spilled paint thinner on the sergeant. Through it all, Carter remained silent, his body shaking with the effort of holding back a scream. Sergeant Hacker, seeing that Carter was holding on by a thread, decided to use his secret weapon for a final blow. He told Gomer that Carter's strange behavior was actually a mental issue caused by holding in his emotions. He suggested a shock treatment. Hacker proposed that Gomer should break the sergeant's prized sword right in front of him to force an emotional release. Hacker promised he would substitute the real sword with a cheap fake so no harm would be done. Gomer was hesitant, but wanted to save his sergeant. He went into the hut, picked up the sword, and snapped it in two. He told Carter to let his emotions out and not to hold anything in. Carter looked at the broken pieces of his treasure and nearly collapsed. However, he maintained his silence. Gomer then explained that Hacker had helped him plan this and that the sword was just a cheap substitute. Carter looked at the broken blade and realized that the inscription proved it was his actual sword. Hacker had never substituted it. He had lied to Gomer to win the bet. Gomer was devastated to learn he had been used, but Carter, strangely, felt a sense of triumph. He realized that because Hacker had cheated and interfered, the bet was essentially over. Furthermore, Carter confessed that he had not actually captured the sword in battle. He had won it in a card game. He told Gomer he would use the winnings from the bet to have the sword repaired. In the final minutes of the challenge, Corporal Slater entered the room. He informed Carter that Hacker had conceded and sent over an IOU for the $50. This was the final straw. Carter erupted. He yelled at Slater for accepting a piece of paper instead of cash and ordered him to stay out of his business and his life. Hacker walked in, laughing, and told Carter he had lost the bet because he yelled with 5 minutes left on the clock. He took the $50 from Carter's desk. But Gomer, ever the innocent observer, pointed out that since Hacker had signed an IOU to Carter earlier, the money actually belonged to Carter anyway. Carter grabbed the cash back, smiling at a frustrated Hacker. As the two sergeants stood there, Gomer looked at Hacker and asked if he was having stomach pains. He suggested that it might not be physical, but mental, and offered to help him let off some steam. The cycle of military life continued, with Carter's lungs healthy and his temper as fiery as ever.